Okay, colleagues, I think we can start. So welcome everyone. This is actually a very exciting moment for us, for the Women's Working Group on FFD. We, as you know, we are organizing this series of webinars on macro solutions for women, the people and the planet. It's a series of action-oriented dialogue that we were thinking that are crucial to have in relation to the macro agendas that are deeply ingrained with the origins of the current crisis as well as the unfolding of it. So this is why we thought it was very important to convene all of us as feminists and activists in global platforms to try to dig deep into what are the challenges and what are the solutions. So as one of the co-conveners of the Women's Working Group on FFD, we are thrilled to have you all here. I just want to say that we had a first dialogue with UN officers from the FFD office and UN Women. It was amazing, and we had also the voice of feminist activists as well. But this is really the first webinar that is really composed of activists, feminist activists. To me, it's like my rock stars, and you will see how we have a lineup of concerts with really rock stars that deserve all of our admiration. So to me, it's like I'm even eager to ask them for their autograph, because it's really amazing the thing that they're doing on the ground. And in this today, you will see the level of analysis paired up with the impetus and the drive to transform on the ground every day. So this is really an honor as well to be moderating this session. I want to say that the Women's Working Group has been working on the financing for development issues since in preparation for the Doha conference, and from then on we were also organizing and trying to facilitate the participation of women from all around the world and the feminist organizations for the Addis Ababa conference. And so this is also a way in which we can gather up and try to make a collective reflection. So I just want to introduce my other colleague, Rosa Lizarde from the Feminist Task Force, who's the other co-convener of these webinars, because she's also been facilitating and one of the founders of the Women's Working Group on FFD. So Rosa, I just wanted to, that you say hi to the people.
Thank you. Thank you, Emilia. I just want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Eurodad. This was a great partnership. It's wonderful that we're able to do this in the second webinar. We're very happy. So thank you, Lidi, Patricia, and Yolanda. And take it away, Emilia. Thank you, all of you, for joining.
Thank you. And so in this case, this second webinar, we are organizing it alongside Eurodad. So thank you so much for this. We are trying to partner with the members of the Women's Working Group to really have this as a collective initiative. So we want to thank Eurodad in organizing this webinar, in drafting the main foundation of this conversation. But really, we also want to thank LatinDad for joining us, and the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, because they are here as well joining us. So I wanted to say some things before we start up. As you will see, we will have translation in Spanish. So we thank very much the interpreters for starters. And I want to give some information on how to do it. If you see below on your screen, there is a little globe that reads interpretation. So if you click on it, you will see how you will have the option on English, Spanish, or have it off. So if you want, you can have interpretation into Spanish. So para las personas que quieren traducción al español, pueden oprimir en el globito que dice interpretación, y allí van a tener las opciones de estar apagado inglés y español, entonces pueden usarlo a lo largo de toda la sesión. I also want to let you know that this session will be recorded. It's for purposes of future dissemination. I just wanted to let you know, and for those of you who don't want to be on the recording, feel free to send us comments through the chat, and we will make sure that these reach the panelists. So just as a background for this webinar, from my end, I'm a feminist. I'm wearing my feminist vision. I am a feminist, and I think, and I'm from Mexico, so I really am convinced that this issue on debt is totally entrenched in and rooted in colonialism, in the very long tradition of an imposition of some peoples over others. And we are seeing now how the very negative impacts of that on white supremacy is really taking a toll on many of our groups of population all around the world. The uprising in the US and other white countries is just, I think, a signal that the extent of that white supremacy and that colonial impact is being felt all around the world, even in those imperialist countries. But why am I saying this? Because that was also starting when countries decided to get their independence, and as a condition for the imperialists to leave, they imposed these debts that are running up until now. As you know, this scandalous figure in the UK about how they just finished paying the traffickers of slaves in 2015, the debts that they acquired with the traffickers, they just finished to pay that, and that is paid with our taxes. And that is just an example in the UK, which is a developed country, and their relation to their own history of colonialism. So I just wanted to highlight how this is really rooted as a systemic problem in the history of the world and in the global configuration. And this is why, just for the sake of justice and global justice, this is a feminist issue. But we will see with our panelists how our feminist analysis goes deep, and we have proposals, we have suggestions, and we have a lot to do in this current pandemic. So I just wanted to highlight that as my feminist start. But you will see all of our panelists will go into different angles. So I'm gonna go with each of you, each of our panelists, introducing you, and then feel free to bring us all of your expertise. And for the audience, my suggestion will be that we leave our three panelists speak. We will have plenty of time to have a live conversation with them. And this is why I will be trying to moderate, to have a very accessible dialogue with you as the audience and our amazing speakers. So we're gonna start with Yolanda Fresnillo, who's also been a very close partner in organizing this. So we thank you for that, Yolanda. Yolanda is a policy and advocacy officer at Eurodad on the justice. She's also a sociologist, a feminist, and activist on the debt movement since the late 1990s. She's the main author of the Eurodad research Out of Service, How Public Services and Human Rights Are Being Threatened by the Growing Debt Crisis, focusing as well on gender impacts on unfurling debt crisis. Yolanda, I just want to start with you on a question that is perhaps more very interesting to us. Like, why is this a matter for concern for the feminist movement? And is there a feminist way to approach the analysis on that and the current, on the one hand, analysis on that and the macro challenges, and on the other, how is that connected to our analysis of the current pandemic that we're seeing and the overall response to it? So over to you, Yolanda.
Thank you very much, Emilia and Ross and the Women's Working Group on FFD for co-organizing this. When we saw you were planning something on debt and gender that we have had in mind for a long time in Eurodad, we didn't add a second to ask for organizing it together, and I hope this is not the first, but one in many actions together. Why debt is a feminist issue, and why feminist movement should be involved in the fight to abolish illegitimate debts and sustainable debts. It's I think it's a question that answers itself because of what you just said about the actual debt crisis being rooted in colonialism, neo-colonialism, the financialization process, and how the patriarchal system is actually interlinked with all those processes. But I'm going to focus more on what we are living today, which, as I say, it's a consequence of those processes. Before the pandemic, we were living an unprecedented increase of debt levels globally, not only in the global south, also in Europe or in other economies. According to the World Bank, which is not our main reference, but they agree with us that this was the largest, the fastest, and the most broad-based increase in debt in emerging and developing economies, as they call them. From previous crises, we know that spiraling public debts mean that public budgets are bearing an increased weight of debt service. So if you increase your debt, you have to pay more interest and more debt service in general, and these consequently have an increased pressure over the different budget lines, including basic services. We published this report out of service last February, showing how debt between 2010 and 2018, external debt payments were increasing as a percentage of government revenues. It went on average from 6% to more than 12% in less than 8 years, meaning that more and more parts of the portions of this government revenue was going to be devoted to paying the debt service, meaning there's less money for public services. And as we know, reducing resources to deliver public services means that there is less gender-sensitive public services. We know that this means that there is less services specifically addressed for women, especially services on gender violence, on prevention and on attention for women victims of gender violence, on healthcare, on maternal care, schools, etc. We know that, and we have seen this in this crisis, that this increasing debt and the push for austerity measures and for privatization has led, for example, the different countries less fit to address the health crisis, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic that we have now. There is a clear overlap between increasing debt and increasing vulnerability on public health, for instance. This is only one example, one of the examples. We could say the same about education, water provision, etc. The neoliberal austerity doctrine that accompanies this debt increase, not only by the imposition of conditionalities or policy advice by the World Bank or the IMF or other IFIs, but also because central governments adopt this doctrine as the only way forward when they face that distress, has meant also budget cuts on public workers and wage caps. This also has an impact on women, and an increase in non-paid care work. I could go for more than 10 minutes only by describing all these interlinkages, but I will just quote a sentence by GADN and Femnet that I think it's very clear. They say the availability of women's unpaid care as a shock absorber is the premise on which cuts to public services are based. So this debt increase leads to public services because they know they can do these cuts because it's women who will bear the cost and bear the extra work that will result from that. The situation is even worse now after the COVID. Debt levels are rising because most of the financing is being made, this emergency financing is being made with loans, but also because revenue is decreasing because of the decrease in exports, in commodity prices, in tourism, in remittances, and of course because of the record capital flight that developing countries are seeing. What should we do with this situation? The offers being made by the G20 and IMF, and we could go into detail afterwards, have fallen far short of what is needed for global South countries to face the global and economic crisis. The G20 debt relief, for instance, is just a temporary suspension. It's not even a cancellation. It only covers a small group of countries. It does not imply participation of private creditors or multilateral development banks. And if we don't want this situation to become a new wave of not only debt, but austerity and cuts, we should call for this immediate debt cancellation of debt payments, and for more comprehensive and long-term approach to the debt crisis resolution, to put in place a framework for resolving the debt crisis in a way that is fair, that is lasting, that it includes all the countries based on the needs of those countries. And when I say needs, I mean human rights guarantee, including women's rights, and even protecting those countries that use their sovereign right and duty to protect human rights and decide not to pay. Those countries in the global South who today might decide, well, we will protect our people before the creditors and decide not to pay, will face litigation in international courts by vulture funds and investors. And that is something that needs to be tackled. And I will finish with that, and we can go more into detail if there are questions. One of the things we are also proposing is to take this opportunity to develop a new approach to debt sustainability for the IFIs, for the creditors, even for some of the borrowers. Debt sustainability means if there is enough money to pay, regardless of if that money should be better invested in protecting human rights or protecting women's rights or protecting the people. We need a new approach to debt sustainability that takes into account environmental needs, climate emergency, human rights, and of course, gender justice. And this is something that could be debated and developed together from the feminist movement and the debt movement. I will leave it to there. I have a longer presentation, but since you said 10 minutes, I think I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. You're right on time, and we look forward to hearing your next round of comments once we are interacting with the audience. This is really interesting because also people always think about macro agendas as it were in a sphere very far away from them, but you're really making the connection on how, yes, those macro issues that are very big dynamics, and that it seems like, oh, this is a global issue. Why do I need to take care of this now when I have more pressing urgent at the national level? But we see how this is impacting directly at the national level, and the inability of the governments to address the let us say also the multi-level needs that the population is having at this moment. So this is a great starter for us, and definitely is an issue that we feminists need to keep on paying attention to. We're gonna go to Patricia Miranda. Patricia is a Global Advocacy Director at LatinDat. She works on that on global and regional levels, coordinating inputs from its member organizations along 3 countries in the region. And she has an expertise at regional, national, and subnational levels. She's part of the CSO Financing for Development Group, member of the steering committee of the Civil 20, and chair of the Financial Transparency Coalition. I will say Patricia is also one of the most featuring stars in the Latin American region. She's one of a key actor, and she's a leader for us as well in how to move forward in addressing these challenges. So it is also a huge pleasure to have Patricia here. Patricia, I wanted to ask you, and going a bit in depth on some of the things that Yolanda already brought up to the table. What are the concerns for developing countries? How is this affecting them directly? And already Yolanda started to mention something about private lenders. I think people is used to hearing about IFIs and the international financial institutions, but from this other aspect, could you also explain to us what is the role that private lenders are having in this current situation, and if you would have any thoughts on what systemic changes do we need to promote from a feminist perspective? So go ahead, Patricia.
Thank you very much, Emilia, and very glad to be part of this great panel and initiative. I would like to start first to bring in a few more linkages on debt and gender from the work we do in our region. And in the moment that a loan is originated, women's needs are not taken into account. For instance, loans or debt basically in southern regions has prioritized infrastructure, financing infrastructure, but these are not loans aimed to finance care infrastructure, to allow a redistribution of non-remunerated work hours from women to the public sector or to men. Another point is that debt resources are not addressing to raise competitiveness in sectors such as agriculture or micro, small and medium enterprises where women's work is strongly represented. And lastly, debt is aimed to keep the dependence, especially in our region, in Latin America, to keep the dependence on extractive industries, which we know it does not benefit directly to women. So having put that idea on the table, because that's a policy that has been going through many decades when we talk about debt. What was the situation before COVID? Some developing countries were in debt distress or even close to a debt default in several regions. Debt risks were already higher before COVID, and debt movements and civil society organizations that work on that were prompting this in every advocacy space we had about the future risks of debt in the world and which countries highlighted the problem. As well, I don't know if you hear me. I'm receiving a strange message here.
Yeah, you froze a bit. I'm hearing you.
Okay, thank you. Well, in addition, debt has a different landscape than the landscape we had decades ago. We have not only the traditional external debt, but we have domestic debt, private debt, external corporate debt, state-owned enterprises, and new risks as public-private partnerships. Some countries, as Yolanda mentioned, have high debt service projections for the next years, which of course undermines social investment. Some countries are already implementing their own fiscal adjustments without even having a program with the IMF, which of course has impacts, especially on social investment. That usually has more impact on women, as well as the austerity measures policies that have been already mentioned. And in general, with the scarce possibilities from our countries to really increase domestic reserves mobilization under a progressive approach. So that was happening before COVID. Now, with the pandemic, as I said, the crisis, multiple crisis has accelerated and arrived to our countries. So our current short-term needs under COVID is the developing countries need urgently resources to first finance lockdowns, especially considering many southern countries have a big informal sector, which is overrepresented by women who earns incomes on a day-to-day basis, and in most cases are heads of households. And second, to improve, we need resources to improve our precarious health systems, which flaws and weaknesses are being carried by women and their no remunerated care work. And with this crisis, we can see, I think all can see more than ever, that the care economy is holding the sustainability of life during this crisis. The current solutions that the global community is offering now, in our view, are basically traditional options, basically new debt, new loans, not really under concessional terms, no grants, few grants, suspension of debt service for the poorest countries, as was mentioned, which in overall, it's not really a solution. It's not enough resources, and it's just a postponement of the problem that in the path will increase inequalities gap. The recession is global and under a no precedent scale. Middle income countries are hardly hit, not just by the pandemic, but as I said, by a multiple crisis. And the recovery will be longer, harder, and painful for developing countries. So in that view, our proposals are that we need immediate and permanent debt service cancellation from multilateral, bilateral, and private lenders. This is not the same debt cancellation as we had in the past. If you remember HIPIC or MDRI, this is a different approach, and we can go further on this and in the Q&As. There is a challenge within all type of creditors, and as Emilia asked, I would make an emphasis on private creditors, which currently they're being asked to do it under a voluntary basis and under conditions that are certainly putting creditors' interest first. In the methodology and the calculations, they are putting their interest first. They're not going to lose any cent. And as civil society organizations, it's important that we start to, it has been done in different times, but I think we can do it all together now and with more strength to directly criticize the principles of the Institute of International Finance, the IIF, and start to put the finger in that processes, in that principles, and in that proposals. Because then again, it's just to postpone the problem, but not address it in the benefit of the poorest and the most hit and vulnerable population. A second proposal is that it's not whether a debt service cancellation takes place. This is a huge crisis with no precedents, and we have heard this in every space. But so this will not be enough. Our developing countries' policies are not comparable with the huge stimulus packages as developed countries are putting in place. So it's important that developing countries have access to grants or to no-cost resources and with no conditionalities involved. So among our proposals on this, besides the cancellation, is to have access to new and fresh resources. An issuance of a special drawing rights from the IMF, which is not in form of debt, but it's to be allocated to the IMF members that actually need it. So it's an issuance as it happened in 2009 with the global financial crisis, where this allocation has been this issuance has been allocated to IMF country members. Our proposal in this is that besides that could take place, it would be important to have a reallocation of these resources. So developed countries that don't need these resources because they have already their own stimulus packages can transfer their special drawing rights, these rights to developing countries that actually need very much these resources. This doesn't involve an IMF program, therefore it doesn't involve a conditionality. It's not a debt because the capital is not repaid, only a few interest rate of 0.05%. And it will be actually mean fresh resources to face this multiple crisis, to use it as a budget support, not as a balance of payments. And in the long term, it's important to keep an eye also in the long term. Why to be more specific in the short term? Because the policies and measures that are being taken now as new loans and a new wave of loans will have, of course, impacts in the middle and long term. But before COVID, we had already a debt monster growing, so it's important to keep an eye on the long-term proposals as to having a debt sustainability assessment that specifies and analyzes the new debt landscape that I mentioned, that contributes to an SDG approach, and to have a change of concept. Currently, according to the IMF, debt sustainability is when a country can repay their debt without having to renegotiate or restructure that debt. We think that debt is sustainable if the repayment of that credit is not affecting the social protection investment. So it's important to have that change now. That would contribute to
2 minutes.
Thank you. That would contribute to avoid a high debt service burden over social investment, and it would also contribute to civil society and to women to have a citizenship surveillance on that, for not to avoid to get to a point where we desperately need a debt restructuring process, to give timely alerts. And the second long-term issue is the debt restructuring process. I'm not going further on that because Yolanda already mentioned. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. So many things to say. I just wanted to say, perhaps later on with the question and answers, people will be able to address the different points of entry they want to hear more of. But I just wanted to highlight how this relates to our demand for governance, and especially a democratic governance at the UN, because as we see, for instance, on this issue on private lenders, they're absolutely willing to send a lawsuit against our developing countries, and that will be also a very pressing issue to deal with. But the other that is related to what we will see in another of our webinars is how IFIs, especially the Bretton Woods institutions, are imposing a very decadent view on development, on imposing conditionalities, on reducing social expenditure and on. And so this is why I'm already going back to my proposition on how this is totally rooted in a colonial dynamic. Those that are powerful imposing still those rules that are keep on extracting from our developing countries. And so, well, with this, I just wanted to invite really one of my most admired and dear feminists in the world. This is Lidi Napsil. We've met in so many battles together, and it's always a pleasure to see her. Lidi As you know, Lydie is the regional coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, and also vice president of the Freedom from Debt Cancellation in the Philippines. And really, Lydie, it's a pleasure to have you here. So perhaps you can touch a bit further on these things that Yolanda and Patricia already started to mention about the role of IFIs, the implications for women, and perhaps if you can go deeper on these issues on governance and financial architecture, what are the challenges and what would be our feminist demands on that respect? So Lydie, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with Yolanda and Patricia. And I must say that I'm very happy to be with them because we've known each other and worked together on this issue for close to 2 decades now, since the Jubilee days in 1999 and the year 2000. And we've learned a lot from each other over the years, and it's good to be, you know, in fighting form again on the debt issue. I'm very happy that, Emilia, you also raised the issue of debt as a colonial legacy, because it's very important for us to understand the history of the debt so that we can have a sharper understanding of what it takes to solve this problem, you know, strategically, and not to have just, you know, temporary short-term stopgap measures. I think the fact that it's the fact that with almost no exception, the first lenders to our countries in the South were our colonial powers speaks of that legacy, you know, as you said. From that very beginning and up to today, I think our experiences today bear out the fact that most of these lending and borrowing transactions are really primarily in the interest of the lenders rather than the borrowers. And that's one of the mainstream narratives that we need to challenge, because they always tell us today, you know, we are lending to the South because you need the money, you need capital, you don't have enough money in the South, there's a lot of poverty, and therefore we're going to lend to you. And that, for us, we know by our own experience, is hardly the truth. That in most cases, the lending is in their interest, and especially this is shown in how they define a debt crisis. And as you said, Mexico, from where you come from, Emilia, that's a very historical country, because the first debt crisis they called in modern history is when Mexico started to default, I think in 1981 maybe, or 82. I don't remember exactly what year now, but we followed pretty soon after that, the Philippines. And I'm mentioning this because the very way they define debt crisis is when the borrowers are not able to pay in full what is due, borrowers are not able to pay on time. And that for them is a debt crisis. That's how it's very much in the vantage point or the perspective of the lenders. But if you take the vantage point of the borrowers, of the people who are affected by the debt, are people in the South, and now no longer just people in the South, but also people in Europe, now in the countries that are in the Eurozone or the Euro debt crisis. From the point of view of our people, it's a perennial crisis. It's a permanent crisis because the debt has always been very much affecting our lives as people. And part of the crisis that we experience every day is caused by this very problem. I'd like to also mention another important part of the dominant narrative that we need to challenge, that is part of this narrative about, you know, the lending is in the interest of the South because we need the money. We also need to be able to say the truth that if you look at the net financial flows, taking into consideration everything, trade, lending, and everything, the net flows are from the South to the North. No? It means we create a lot of wealth in the South. The problem is we're not able to keep it because the structural relations are such that the wealth flows from our countries to the South. You see that in trade, you see that in extraction, you see that in lending, because we pay a lot in terms of interests. And if you put all of that together, that's what the figures will tell all of us, that the flows, in fact, the wealth is coming from the south to the north. And that's one of the things we need to challenge, especially if you put it in historical context. If you look at the historical and ecological debts, that's something that we've always also been raising in contrast to the financial debts that we supposedly owe the international lenders, the northern lenders. We are owed much more than what we supposedly owe them in terms of that long history of plunder. And when others tell you, well, that's history, that's already past. If you look at the net flows today, that is still part of that history is still constantly being made and recreated even in current relations. So one of the things we're saying is that we cannot only address the outstanding debt. That's only part of the problem. And even with a series of debt cancellations, there's always an accumulation and a reaccumulation of this debt. And that will happen unless we change the entire system, unless we change the financial system, and unless we change the fact that this financial system has become even more dominant than what they call is the real economy. No? So it has a logic of its own. Money makes money. It has almost no relationship with with actual production and production of goods and services. That's part of what Yolanda has mentioned as financialization. So we need to take a more systemic approach. I'm not discounting the need for debt cancellation. That is a very urgent need. But we need to take also a more strategic and systemic approach so that we can once and for all end the problem of the debt. So we're hoping that this crisis is going to be an opportunity for us to reassert some of the more strategic processes and parts of the solutions that we have been asserting for a long time. We need to be able to set the course for a review of these debts. You know, we have called for debt audits, for instance, for many years, and we need to renew that call again so that this process can be a process for people to have a better understanding of how these debts were created and what are the solutions and the more systemic solutions to address them. I just like to end with, just a little bit more kind of adding to how women are affected by all of this, and maybe just to put it in a little bit more summary. The debt affects us in different layers of different layers and dimensions. The first, which Yolanda and Patricia has also elaborated on, is how it has affected public services. And that has affected women because of our traditional roles in the care economy. Yolanda has spoken about how we absorb what cannot be provided by government, by services, how we have to absorb as women the care that we need that our families need when the government is not able to provide, and we cannot afford to access it through market because it has become very expensive. It has been privatized. It has been commercialized. And we see that now very stark during the COVID-19 crisis. No? It's not just those who get sick from COVID-19, those who get sick from any other illness or disease are not able to receive the healthcare they need because of the severe pressures it has on the public health system. You don't even want to go to the hospital because they turn you away. They cannot handle anything, not COVID-19 and not any other disease. So people are at home and women absorb everything. The second is it affects economies. The debt affects economies. And when there's severe economic pressure, women are affected the most because we bear several layers of that disadvantage as women, as workers, and as being part of families which feel the pressure of the economic crisis and the relationship that has to the rise of domestic violence. That is what women are talking about in communities. Their husbands are home during the quarantine period. And there's a lot of pressure in the family, and domestic violence has really risen in these times, during these times. we are also affected not just by the debt service, we're also affected by the projects that are financed through loans and the conditionalities that come with these loans. So there's a lot of stories to tell. What kind of projects are being financed by loans? So we need not just to look at the aggregate amounts of debt service and debts owed. We need to look at what projects have been financed by debts. And I guess just to wrap up, I know I probably have taken more time than I should. We really are very challenged to take on this issue again, but make sure also that we relate it with the call for a reboot and a rebuilding of the economy, not just to solve the crisis of the system now, but to take advantage of the situation so that we can begin to rebuild economies away from what we have today, the system that we have today. We don't want to recover in the same kind of system. We want to take advantage of this situation to call for a major shift away from the current system that we have today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liddy. Actually, you were not only right on time, but you were spot on in everything you said. I'd say we have this challenge, as you mentioned, in following the proposals that our previous speakers said about addressing this in an urgent manner. But what are the long-term measures, but also the systemic interrelations to the other let us say, struggles that we're fighting in the economic justice dimension, so that we are really having a comprehensive approach and not necessarily trying to fix it only from technical point of entry, but really trying to see this whole dynamic wealth flowing from the south to the north. And I will just go, I'd say there are so many elements that the three of you mentioned, but just to wrap up and open the floor to the audience, is how the care economy is a shock absorber on the one hand, and so countries rely on the care economy as, okay, I'm gonna add more pressure on it, I'm gonna withdraw more, it doesn't matter, women are gonna be there with their elasticity in time and in unpaid domestic and care work production, so it's like it doesn't matter, add more to that. And the other, and this is very much closely linked to the dynamic of conditionalities and austerities that have been imposed by the international financial institutions. And it's like they don't hear how we keep on calling for human rights, for gender equality, for environmental criteria, and they keep on adding on the same recipe, despite even UN human rights rapporteur telling them this has to stop. And the worrisome thing is that despite that, those warnings we had in the past saying we are in the face of a huge economic and financial crisis coming from illicit financial flows and coming from debt crisis, and no one listened, and we're here now all as well facing a huge pandemic, and rumor has it from FAO a very likely famine. So this is the situation in which we are at, and that solutions and proposals that are, as Patricia was mentioning, more on the side of loans rather than on grants, and to really reject conditionalities that are imposing reduction on this ability of the population to recover, and really to give a field for resource domestic mobilization for ensuring human rights as a whole. So I'm gonna stop here. So thank you so much for our speakers. They just gave us so much to discuss. So there is a question here addressed for Yolanda on the relation on language on the 2015 Truth Committee on the Greek public debt, which has a definition on sustainable debt in relation to debt and human rights. So perhaps you can go in depth on that. And but I will also open this question to the three of you, if you want, if you have something to say about it, because it tackles on the very definition of a problem. What is unsustainability of debt? on the one hand, and then after that we will go to see what are the other notions that our audience is feeling that are crucial to address from a feminist point of view. So I will open this question to the three of you because I'd say it has many of the elements that you mentioned. But Yolanda, you go first.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's in fact a very good question. When the different countries have started debt audit processes, one of the questions is, what are we auditing? If we are auditing debt illegitimacy, but also debt sustainability, not in the way the IMF and the World Bank does with their debt sustainability analysis. That is done. That is a technical analysis on payment capacity, which is normally not taking in account all the issues that they should take in account when analyzing paying capacity. But if we understand that a debt isn't sustainable, as the Truth Committee on the Greek public debt defined, when the borrower state does not have the capacity to fulfill its basic human rights obligations relating healthcare, education, water, sanitation, or adequate housing. I mean, if we could include those elements into the debt sustainability concept, that would be putting a gender perspective and a feminist perspective into debt sustainability somehow. And I think the question asks if some steps have been done in this sense, and if we have received any answers on this by the institutions. I think the institutions are willing to engage in a debate on that sustainability, but not on these terms, probably. More in how can they improve this assessment on payment capacity. And for instance, the IMF has done some steps on including in their debt assessment, debt sustainability assessment, climate vulnerabilities. Not big steps, small steps, but they are willing to include some of those. Probably not from a feminist perspective. When we see how the IMF, for instance, is I would say trying, but maybe that's too generous, trying to include a gender perspective into their work, they only see women as possible workers. I mean, they think including a gender perspective is only and only opening possibilities for women to get into the paid labor market. That's the only role that they see for us. They don't really recognize the care economy. They say they do. They say they take into account, but when they do the analysis, it's not there. And when they do the policy recommendations, that's not there either. One of the things I would say, and I'll finish with that, is that when we analyze this debt sustainability, for example, with citizens' participation and with feminist movement participations, if we should, that's a question more than an affirmation, if we should take into account what Lydia and Patricia mentioned on what this debt was used for, what was funded with this debt, which kind of projects have been funded, and which kind of gender impacts does this project lending had, which is something that some of the debt audit processes, such as the one in Ecuador, got into account, which analyzed the gender impact of the lending, and I'll leave it to Lydia and Patricia to complement.
Thank you so much, but very, very rich elements to keep on talking on. So Patricia, you wanna say something about this?
Thanks, Emilia. Well, Yolanda had a very good approach. I would just like to add that on the debt sustainability, as I read the question that was raised, Yes, the IMF assessment looks at the capacity of repayment, but this is not exhaustive enough, it's not complete. And from when we at the national levels analyze if we are able to repay that debt, our answer is usually no. But according to the IMF's assessment is yes. So that's why first we push for having a more exhaustive and complete analysis of that. And in addition, its projections are over optimistic, and that usually then have to be changed because that didn't happen in that optimistic way that was projected. But that is with the IMF. But if we speak of other loans, if we speak of bilateral lenders or regional banks, usually some of them, they don't even do this kind of analysis of the capacity of repayment. So that's even worse enough. That's even worse. And the other thing is how transparent is this, and if citizens and if civil society in general is aware of these projections, if we, not only civil society but even parliamentarians who are finally the ones that approve a credit, are they aware? Do they have enough information to know if a country is able to repay that debt in the future with no over optimistic projections? That is one thing. And the other is that there has been an inability to link these assessments with development, with SDGs, or with national development plans. So it's completely one thing, the national development plan, where many people takes part on to put inputs on with the gender approach and with what do we want on our development. We don't want more infrastructure. We bought this idea that southern countries have an infrastructure gap, therefore we need more credits to fill that infrastructure gap. But there's a separate thing to when we speak about a national development plans or the SDGs, and how are we going to finance that? And it's important to make that to close that bridge, because the financing policies to address that are actually increasing inequalities gap, and I think that's where we need to put our finger on. And well, I think I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And perhaps also adding to what you are saying, this proposal on a debt workout mechanism that is not only addressing issue as issue and case by case, right, but really overseeing the encompassing, let us say, dimensions or levels that are in relation to the debt crisis. Lydie, do you want to comment on the question we received? It's in the chat of Q&A.
About the Chiara's question or Tetet's question now.
No, we are still on the definition on sustainable debt.
Sustainability. Okay.
Yeah.
Of course, saying that sustainability should be defined in terms of what can the country really afford without compromising the state's obligation to provide these services in full, no, not just in minimal terms, but to provide all these essential services in full, and to be able to fulfill its obligations towards all its citizens in building an economy that actually provides for what is a humane and dignified life for all. Of course, it has been part of the message of debt movements for a long time. But one of the important layers that we need to add to that is it's also not just simply a question of being able to pay. With all these terms, it's also very much a question of, should we even pay? So because we're talking about public debts, we're talking about debts that were taken out in the name of people, and that's being paid for by people's money. So it shouldn't be just a question of, well, can I afford to pay this? It should be a question of, why am I being paid to pay for debts that have financed projects that I haven't even benefited from? And when we say that, we also need to challenge also this kind of like narrative, part of the mainstream narrative, that when there's a problem of the debt, it's a problem of the debtors. It's because the governments are corrupt, because the governments, borrowing governments wasted this money and so on. That's true, yeah. But it's also true in many cases, there are lender-driven debts that were designed not really to benefit the economy of the South, but to benefit the economies and to meet economic needs of the lending countries. And there are example after another throughout history and even today that our countries were peddled debts and projects to be financed by debts that are not necessarily needed by our economies and least of all our people. So I think we need to put that also as prominent as the question of what is this level of ability to pay that we're talking about. We also need to talk about the justness of being made to pay for many of the debts that we didn't actually benefit from. And I'd also like to say something about the problem of the debt, I guess that leads us into some of the succeeding questions. It's not just an impact on our economy, it's an impact on the power relations between the lending countries and the borrowing countries, between the lending institutions and the borrowing countries. And, you know, this is, for instance, a very kind of like a very good example of this is the power that the IMF has on our economies and our countries, on how it can actually, we use the word dictate, but some are saying, well, yeah, but some of our economic managers in our countries actually think along the same lines. So it's a collusion, yeah, between the IMF and those in our countries who are in power and think along the same neoliberal paradigm that are running our economies. But you can't take away the fact that the IMF has that power. And part of that power is because of this international financial system that also looks to the IMF to be giving signals whether an economy and a government is doing well, is managing their economy well. And oftentimes that means austerity measures so that they can pay their debts. And so there's this irony that many governments today, if offered debt relief, will refuse it because they fear that they will no longer be able to borrow heavily from the financial markets if they were known as beneficiaries of debt relief. We have heard governments say that. They're very wary of accepting debt relief because that is like acknowledging that they are in trouble. And to acknowledge that you are in trouble makes it very hard for you to borrow from the financial market. So they want to keep up this pretense that they're doing all right. Our government has refused debt relief at least 3 times in the last 15 years that it was actually offered. Yeah. So this is one of the things, and that power in itself should be questioned. And it's ridiculous, I think, for groups to think that we should use this power, for instance, the power of the IMF, to try to discipline our governments and our economy so that they should do the right thing. I think that's a ridiculous idea that should be rejected.
Well, thank you so much for this, Lydia, as well. It reminded me of a session that took place on the FFD convening on COVID-19, in which I think about the World Bank, who was calling for debt cancellation, but not on the IFI's loans, because they said, because we will run out of money, so we should cancel all of the other debts, but not ours. And everybody's saying, yes, let's cancel all the debts, but the one on the other side and not ours. So what are the real implication on debt cancellation, or as you are saying as well, when there are real possibilities on the table, how is that perceived? And we're seeing that we are really digging into the real challenges rather than just having a general call, no? But this is what is behind what the activists on debt have been asking all this time. So thank you for this. We have 3 questions, so we can also, I'm gonna read them all, and you decide which one do you want to respond. The first one is by Tetet. Hey, Tetet. She's asking about what is your impression on a proposal by Chile to the session held at the UNFCCC on Youth Momentum on Climate Change, because Chile was proposing that IMF should make green recovery a conditionality for loans. Oh, Jesus. So both, all of the words that we don't like, right? Green and conditionality and loans. But it says like, these conditionalities like green jobs, just transition. And Chile even said that IMF should do some kind of structural adjustment programs for green recovery. So what are your thoughts on this? This is one question. Another, Maria Jose Lubertino, hello, Maria Jose. She's proposing that we should prepare a document on debt and human rights. Actually, this is a good idea for the Women's Working Group. We are gathering and compiling all this knowledge and trying to come up with summaries and specific papers. So we will take into consideration this proposal. And but the question she is already posing to the panelists is, do you have documents on or materials on this topic with concrete solution proposals that can be shared with our governments? And we, as Women's Working Group, we will be working on advocacy materials, but this is a good time if you want to share links with us as well, so that we can send them to our audience. Gabi Ore Aguilar, hi Gabi. She's thanking you all and asking, what have we learned from the 2018 crisis about debt and gender, and what should we be doing differently this time based on those lessons? Emma, we're so sad you're not with us since the beginning, but she's saying that there's been some conversation about a feminist debt workout mechanism and what a feminist rating agency could look like. Oh, I love this question. So I'm gonna stop here, and then we're gonna have a second row of questions. This is very rich. So we love our audience as much as we love our speakers. So go ahead. I'm gonna start now in the inverse order. So Lily, go ahead first.
I started also answering Tetet's question about the IMF and using conditionality for countries to go on a green recovery. Well, first of all, as I said, why should we use the illegitimate power that IMF has over our countries in order to get our countries to do the right thing, if that's really even possible for the IMF to do that? I don't think any kind of economic program will work unless it's really driven internally by the countries, and unless there's real genuine political will inside the countries. If it's coming as conditionality, it's not going to actually work. And secondly, it's really far off to even dream that the IMF would actually be coming up with really good economic policies, especially policies that will contradict what it has stood for since it was established, for more than, how old are they now? More than 60 years now. And, I think people who are going down that road are going to be really in for a very abrupt, a shock that it's actually not going to work. And let's not waste even our time around that. There's this last question that struck me, and this is something that we haven't actually also addressed enough, and that is the problem about the new forms of debt, relatively new, but for some countries it's been around for a long time, and that's debts from the financial markets. That's through the sale of bonds and securities. And the problem about that, it's a little bit more difficult to deal with in terms of solutions and measures, because it's a very fluid thing. So these debt papers can be sold and resold in the secondary markets. And oftentimes, this is what happens when the new borrowers buy the new owners of the papers buy the papers on pennies to the dollar, as has been described, and then they sue in order for the government who issued the papers to pay them the full face value. So they make a lot of money, and in the process, that is, exploiting the the suffering and the misery of the people in that country, because then the government is going to be made to pay for those debts in full. So this is a big challenge for the debt movement. How do we deal with debts that's incurred through bonds and securities? You can't just say, oh, we're not going to pay. You don't even know who's holding the debt papers now. And often we don't have any control or power in the debt markets. So that's one of the things. And one of the issues we have about that is we also need to have preventative measures. We can't just address them when the problems already come up. So one of the issues here is the over-reliance of our governments in the financial markets for borrowing from the financial markets. We need to stop that, and we need to stop this business of over-reliance on borrowings, which is, again, a legacy of how our economies has been built through decades.
Thank you so much, Lily, for this. We could listen to you all day. Patricia, what are your thoughts on the rich questions we received?
Thanks, Emilia. Well, really, indeed, ritual questions. I just would like to say on the green recovery, and this is a conversation I had yesterday with several colleagues that work on macroeconomics and gender, and we are still wondering what exactly the IMF means about this, and what are the steps that it's not only saying, but we were really wondering, well, how are they proposing to do this? I would just stick with an intervention that you had Alicia Bárcena from ECLAC yesterday, and she said, well, we just don't want a green recovery, we want a multicolor recovery that has a gender approach. And the steps towards this from global policy stakeholders, we have not seen yet. So I think it sounds good, but the policies that are being implemented to face this crisis are not reflecting that. Regarding what documents on these issues, well, from Latin, we are working on a debt and gender report from specifically where we will add our Latin American views on that. So we will share it when we have that prepared. But on the other side, I take the advantage also to share that we are organizing as well a debt and gender webinar with a Latin American perspective, along with the Women's Major Group and other important networks and allies. So also please stay tuned for this. And there was a very interesting question about rating agencies. And yes, I think that in this crisis, we can question what is the role of credit rating agencies. I mean, they are downgrading rates for developing countries under the current crisis. And when we think about developed countries that don't have a problem of fiscal space, that countries that can print their own money with no risks and no problems for their economies. And in the other side, there is a developing countries as our countries that the main option they have now is to get more loans to address this crisis. We have already discussed all the relations and linkages between debt and gender. In our case, Latin America is the most unequal region in the world. So based on this current system of the current inequalities existing here and the direct impact on women of any economic policies under this unequal system, then any downgrade from a credit agency, rate agency to our countries is immediately to increase the interest rates. Several Latin American countries, because this is the information I have at hand, are already issuing sovereign bonds to face this crisis. Any downgrading from any credit rate agency to our countries would imply to have an increased rate for those loans, and that immediately means that it will have a higher debt service, which a higher debt burden that has the impacts that we already know, increasing inequalities, that countries, of course, will prioritize to repay those bonds instead of guaranteeing minimal social protection floors. And so that is the consequence of the role that credit agencies are having, and we need to put that more in the spot and say it more loud about this really questionable role that they're having during this crisis.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Yolanda, what you have the question on the feminist debt workout mechanism, the lessons learned from the 2008 crisis, or this issue on green conditionalities.
Yeah, on this last issue, yeah, I agree that we should be very careful on demanding for IMF conditionality. I am among those who believe there is not such thing as positive conditionality, because it should be the country's sovereign right to decide where to invest their revenue. And it should be the people's right in each country to put pressure on their government for gender budgeting, for example, or for green budgeting, but not the IMF from up to bottom imposing what to where does the money has to be invested in, especially because of the linkages and the linkages of the IMF with the capital interest and the multinational corporations, and the risk that this green recovery would mean business for the same people that have been doing business with the privatization of the public services and fossil fuels, etc. So it would be a bailing out of these corporations, and that's one of my worst fears. I think this global Green Deal or Care New Deal, as Diane Nelson put it the other day, should come from bottom up, and that's the only way we can make sure it's a fair proposal and not something to bail out businesses as usual. I really like the idea of a feminist rating agency. I was just thinking we could rate on triple P of patriarchal to different government sovereign bonds or something like that, yeah, or triple F if there is a nice policy going on from a feminist point of view. But I think it could be a very nice communication action together with what is a more serious proposal, which is a feminist debt workout mechanism. I think if there is a fair resolution for debt, and if we push for a fair mechanism to provide a fair debt resolution, it should be feminist. It should bear in mind, it should include this feminist and gender perspective into it. Otherwise, it won't be a fair and transparent debt workout mechanism, as we have been demanding for many years now. And it should be explicit. We should be very vocal within the debt movement that there is no resolution to the debt crisis unless it is a feminist resolution. What this sentence means, this is something we need to work on, because we have the headlines and we have the analysis, but we need to have the proposals. One of the things I was reflecting on the other day was we've been also pushing for a binding principles on responsible lending and borrowing, following from all the debates and results in the UN and in the UNCTAD on the principles on responsible lending and borrowing. when we say this lending does not benefit women and does not benefit gender justice, are we saying that there is some kind of lending and some kind of financing that could be gender responsive? And what characteristic does it have? What proposals do we have to our governments if they want to borrow from a feminist perspective? Does that exist? This is a debate that we need to have, and it needs to be put on our government's table. And I'm just going to finish with the question, I think it was from Maria Jose, on if we have any document to present to our governments. The report that we did at Eurodat previous to the COVID, which is on the debt crisis and public services, has a final page on recommendations. And I think this could be used, and it was done with an explicit gender perspective. But also the statement signed by more than 200 organizations calling for a debt jubilee, for debt cancellation and new financing, general on debt. This is something that the feminist movement could use. But I agree that maybe we could work together on a more specific document on debt, human rights, and specifically on women's rights and gender justice. I could go for 1 hour on what lessons learned from the 2008 crisis, but I don't think we have the time, so I'll go on for the next round, or I don't know if we have much more time.
Yeah, thank you. We have 5 minutes left, but first of all, thank you all. And Lydie had to leave. She warned us that she was going to jump into another webinar, but so happy that we got her wisdom for a while with us. And I just wanted to say, perhaps I can read the next questions, and you can just make use of some of those elements to wrap up. And just we want to make an announcement that we will have a Spanish webinar organized in conjunction with Latindad, Eurodad, and the Women's Working Group. And we will be working more depth on Latin American cases. So maybe also many of these questions can be addressed there. And so, okay, let us go through this. So Grove Harris, hi Grove, she's asking if can lenders be held responsible for predatory lending, maybe Puerto Rico, we can leave that to the Latin American case. And she's asking about the possibility of separating public financing from private financing. And Maria Jose is asking more specific issues on logistics, which I'll go back to. But if you want Patricia and Yolanda to give us some closing remarks, and if you want to tackle on these issues or general comments, and if you have a hashtag, we are very excited about hashtags now.
I was thinking on the hashtag question, and I think that the hashtag I just gave it before, like there is no solution to debt if it's not a feminist solution. It's a bit too long for a hashtag, but I think it might work. On the questions, lenders can be held responsible for predatory lending, but it's very difficult, lengthy, and costly. And for instance, there is a very interesting process in Mozambique, and a couple of lenders have been in court and processed in the UK for hidden debts and for corruption on sort of a predatory lending case. But it's normally the lenders who use these tools against the borrowers. And on separate government financing and private financing, I don't really know what growth means, but I think one of the requests from the debt movement is to have a broader transparency, or full transparency on debt issues. So more than hold separate, we should have full detail of what is under government financing, but especially under private financing, who owes to whom, who holds a country's debt. When a country that, as Patricia explained before, issues debt in the financial markets as bond issuing, and these bonds are resold in the secondary markets, the government who issued those bonds can be found in a situation where they don't know who holds their debt, who is holding that debt, who do they owe that debt to. And that is a problem in terms of negotiating restructuring or cancellations. So a public registry of debt would be something we could be calling for. And to wrap up, I think we need to work together from the feminist and the debt movement, because the debt movement needs the feminist movement in order to make better proposals and to advance in our work. And I think from the debt movement, we have done a lot of work in the past that could also have an added value to the feminist movement. So a coalition here is mostly needed in the times that come ahead. And one of the processes that I think have been in the past powerful in terms of joining the efforts are the idea of debt audits and the idea of analyzing debt together from the financial point of view, but also from the human, social, environmental, and gender point of view. I think this open dialogue among feminists and development finance group on the debt sustainability concept, on feminist responsible lending and borrowing, on a feminist rating agency. I'm still going on with this idea. It's altogether a very good way to go, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. Patricia, your final remarks, comments, hashtag.
Thank you, Emilia. Well, I need to think in a hashtag that works also for Latin America and in Spanish. Well, I was thinking on this question about public and private. I would like to dig more on private financing and to put on the table more risks that this involve. Is among the most expensive sources of financing for any country. Is fast. And countries can basically use on whatever budget item they want to, but it's the most expensive, and it's really very complex to think of a renegotiation of this, because as has been mentioned, we don't know who are the owners of these bonds, and to increase the problem is not only at national levels. And the last years, and in many countries in Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, and others, are state-owned enterprises are issuing bonds that are owned by external but foreign investors, as well as subnational governments. So it's not at national levels, so the risk increases more, and the burden on the debt increases more, with all the impacts that we have already discussed before, and there's not enough information, so it's very hard to assess what's the size of this risk. And I would like also to put some other issue on the table, which is the debt, the external debt of the private sector, which is the corporate debt. And this is part of the lessons learned from the last financial crisis, as someone was asking, because the public sector rescued the private sector, and that involved to add more a heavy burden on the debt service for the public sector, of course undermining social investments, social protections, and having gender impacts and women and human rights as well. And nobody right now in this crisis is talking too much about this debt. And in the case of Latin America, the level of this debt, this corporate debt, is almost the same size, has been raising a lot in the last year, and is almost the same size as the public debt, external debt. And right now, nobody is paying that much attention to this. So I think that it's also something, an important issue, because of the impacts that we know it could have in our countries. And to close, I would say and agree with what Yolanda mentioned about we need to put this more on the table. What is the relation, what are the impacts of the current policies on gender? It's not only debt that we are addressing now, it's the whole unequal system, economic and financial system, that this is our chance to make any change in it. If under these multiple crises we cannot put on the table our most ambitious proposals, I don't know when would it be the opportunity. And it's uh, and it's important for us to keep putting on the table that um, and I'm taking this from a feminist in Latin America that says economics is not gender neutral. Actually, it is the economic and financial policies are blind to gender, and we need to remove that from many people's eyes to eliminate that blindness, because there is a huge impact. And I think that this crisis is showing these inequalities more than ever. So that's to close, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for our speakers. It was brilliant. And thank you so much for reminding us that there will be no solution to that if it's not feminist, and the type to act is now, is not, if not now, when. So thank you so much for these two main messages. We ran out of time. I just wanted to say we have a lot of things to keep on working. So the invitation would be, if you want to keep on working closely with us, do send us an email to Rosa Lizarde or myself. Our emails are in the invitations that we sent around, on asking that you want to join the Women's Working Group. What is your name, your organizations, and the reason you would like to join the Women's Working Group. We will be sending out the links on a YouTube channel so that you can listen to this and watch this webinar again, and also to listen to the recording of our first webinar. Stay tuned to our next webinar next week with the Third World Network on trade and intellectual property rights, on health and food systems, now that we have the pandemic and the threat of an upcoming famine. So thank you so much. We look forward to keep on engaging with you. And as Patricia announced, we are also working on a Spanish webinar on the Latin American region, and hopefully later on other regions. But for the time being, 6 minutes past the limit. I thank you both. I thank the audience. Thank you so much for those who were helping us with the translation and the interpretation, and looking forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.